The dawn of January 22nd, 1943, on Guadalcanal did not bring peace. The air was thick and wet, heavy with the smell of damp earth, rotting vegetation, and the lingering, faint acridity of cordite. In this oppressive humidity, 2nd Lieutenant John George of the 132nd Infantry Regiment crouched low in the skeletal remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. At 27 years old, he was a man out of place, an island of quiet focus in a sea of institutional doubt. His focus was directed through the lens of a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. The jungle around Point Cruz was a different kind of hell than the one they had just left. For 16 brutal days, George's battalion had assaulted Mount Austin, a heavily fortified Japanese position they called the Gifu. It was a meat grinder of fixed positions, machine gun nests, and brutal close-quarters combat. They had finally taken the western slope on January 2nd, but at a horrific cost. 34 men killed, 279 wounded. Through it all, George's Winchester Model 70, the rifle he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy, had remained silent. He had carried it, a quiet act of defiance, but the close-range, chaotic fighting of Mount Austin offered no opportunity for the precision it was built for. The mocking from his commanding officer, Captain Morris, and the other platoon leaders had only intensified. Toy, mail-order sweetheart. The jibes were constant. Why would a soldier in a modern army, issued the semi-automatic M1 Garand, insist on carrying a bolt-action hunting rifle? But Point Cruz was different. This was not a battle for a fortified hill. This was a war of shadows in a tangled, living maze. The Japanese soldiers here were not in bunkers. They were ghosts who had retreated west from Henderson Field, melting into the immense, ancient trees of the coastal groves. Some of these ghosts were snipers, equipped with scoped Arisaka rifles. They knew the jungle intimately. They knew how to wait, to become part of the canopy, to strike with terrifying suddenness and then vanish. In the past 72 hours, these unseen marksmen had killed 14 men from George's regiment. One moment a soldier was filling his canteen in a creek, the next he was dead. A patrol would walk down a trail, pass a tree twice, and on the second pass, a man would be shot through the neck from above. The snipers were inflicting a deeper psychological toll than the fixed defenses of Mount Austin ever could. Fear was a constant companion, and morale was crumbling. The battalion commander was desperate. The Japanese snipers were thinning his ranks faster than malaria. In this climate of fear and frustration, the commander summoned John George on the night of January 21st. The conversation was blunt. The mockery was set aside, replaced by a grim necessity. He needed someone who could shoot. He had heard the stories of George being an Illinois state champion. He looked at the lieutenant and his unusual rifle and posed the essential question. Could that mail-order weapon actually hit anything? George, a man of few words, explained his credentials without boast. The Illinois state championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. At 23, he had been the youngest winner in the state's history. He spoke of shooting 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, and with his Lyman Alaskan scope, putting 5 rounds inside a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. It was not bravado, it was a simple statement of fact. The commander gave him until the next morning to prove it. The theory was about to meet the brutal reality of combat. That night, while the jungle hummed and chittered around him, George prepared his tool. In the dim light of his tent, he meticulously cleaned the Winchester once more, though it was already spotless. It had been packed in cosmoline for its ocean voyage, and had waited for him in a warehouse while he sailed to Guadalcanal unarmed, watching other men clean their government-issued Garands. When it finally arrived via military mail in a wooden crate marked "Fragile," it was like being reunited with a part of himself. He checked the scope mounts for the 100th time, ensuring they were tight and true. He loaded the rifle not with standard military ball ammunition, but with the .30-06 hunting rounds he had carefully packed back in Tennessee. This was the cartridge the Garand fired, but his were different, precision-made for a single, accurate shot, not for volume of fire. At dawn, he moved out alone. He brought no spotter, no radio man. He carried only his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition stored in stripper clips. His chosen position was the ruined bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. It overlooked the coconut groves where intelligence believed the snipers operated from the massive banyan trees, some towering 90 feet high with trunks 8 feet thick. A man could climb one before first light and sit there, invisible, all day long. George settled into the rubble. The bunker offered a clear field of view, but it also made him a target. He was betting on his ability to see the enemy before they saw him. He raised the rifle, the stock cool and familiar against his cheek. The Lyman Alaskan scope had only 2.5 power magnification, not much by later standards, but it was a window into a world of detail the naked eye would miss. He began his work, a slow, methodical dance of observation. He glassed each tree, left to right, top to bottom. The jungle was never silent. Birds called, insects droned, artillery rumbled in the distance. George had learned to filter out the noise, to focus solely on the subtle language of movement. At 9:17, he saw it. A branch moved. There was no wind. It was just a small, unnatural shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. George didn't rush. He held his breath, his body still. He watched. The branch moved again, and then his eyes, trained by years of competitive shooting, pieced together the shape hidden within the leaves and shadows. A man, clad in dark clothing, positioned perfectly in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, his attention fixed on the trail where George's battalion moved its supplies. He had no idea his hunter had arrived. George adjusted his scope, 2 clicks right for wind. The process was automatic, ingrained. He controlled his breathing, feeling the slow, steady rhythm. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, a 3.5-pound pull he had spent hours perfecting on the ranges of Camp Perry before the war. This was the moment of truth. All the mockery, the doubt, the years of training, the long voyage, the weeks of waiting, it all narrowed to this single point. He would find out if a civilian target rifle, in his hands, could kill a man who was trained to kill him first. He squeezed the trigger. The report of the Winchester was sharp and distinct, cracking through the jungle's ambient noise. The rifle kicked solidly into his shoulder. Through the scope, 240 yards away, he saw the Japanese sniper jerk violently and then fall. The body tumbled down through the layers of branches, a dark sack of flesh and bone, before hitting the ground with a distant, final thud near the base of the banyan tree. George's hands moved with practiced efficiency. He worked the bolt. The empty, smoking brass cartridge spun out of the ejection port with a ping. He chambered another round, the sound crisp and mechanical. He immediately shifted his focus, his eye returning to the scope, scanning the same tree, then the ones nearby. He knew the doctrine. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If he had just killed the shooter, the spotter was still out there, likely close, and now aware of his presence. The first test was over. The duel had begun. The immediate silence after the shot felt heavier than the jungle humidity. George's heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the hunt. He kept the crosshairs trained on the banyan tree, his finger resting along the trigger guard. Every sense was heightened. The chirping of birds that had ceased after the gunshot now slowly returned, a sign that the immediate danger had passed. for the moment. He knew the spotter was there. Somewhere in that green labyrinth, another pair of eyes was now searching for him. The spotter would have marked the direction of the muzzle flash, the sound. George remained statue still, his breathing shallow. He shifted his gaze methodically, scanning not just the original tree but the surrounding canopy. The Lyman Alaskan's 2.5x magnification forced patience. He had to piece the puzzle together branch by branch, shadow by shadow. 26 minutes later, at 9:43, he found the second piece. Movement. Lower and in a different tree about 60 yards north of the first. A Japanese soldier, the spotter, was climbing down the trunk in a hurried, retreating scramble. He had heard the shot, seen his partner fall, and knew his position was compromised. He was trying to flee. George led the moving target slightly, the familiar calculations of range and drop coming automatically. He exhaled slowly and squeezed. The rifle barked a second time. The soldier flung his arms out, falling backward from the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of his body. Both hit the ground within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip, his hands remarkably steady. The simmering anxiety that had plagued him for weeks, the doubt, the ridicule, had evaporated, replaced by a cold, focused calm. This was what he was trained for. This was no different than a championship match at Camp Perry, except the targets could shoot back. And they did. At 11:21, a bullet snapped past his head and struck the sandbag 6 inches from his face, spraying dirt and grit into his eyes. He dropped and rolled left, pressing himself against the cool, damp concrete of the bunker wall. His heart was in his throat now. This shot had come from a different direction, the southwest. A third sniper, unrelated to the first pair, had found him. He waited for 3 full minutes, listening. The jungle had gone quiet again. Cautiously, he inched back to his firing position. The shooter would have moved after taking the shot. That was Sniper 101, shoot and scoot. But in this dense terrain, relocation options were limited. George began the slow, painstaking process again, glassing the trees to the southwest. He found him at 11:38, 73 feet up in the third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans. The sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but had made a fatal error. He'd stayed in the same tree. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape, a shadow among shadows, and fired. The third sniper fell without a sound. By noon, the body count was 5. The news, passed in hushed tones along the American lines, spread like a brush fire. The men who had scoffed at the mail-order sweetheart now looked at the quiet lieutenant with a new, reverent awe. A few even asked if they could come up to the bunker to watch him work. George refused them all. Spectators meant movement, noise, and distraction. They would draw fire, and in this game, drawing fire meant death. The Japanese snipers adapted. The free shots were over. After the 5th kill, the afternoon stretched into an unnerving silence. George glassed the groves for hours, his eyes straining, but saw nothing. The ghosts had learned their lesson and vanished. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting for him. The mocking tone was gone, replaced by a commander's blunt assessment. "How many?" Morris asked. "5 confirmed, sir," George replied. 12 rounds fired. Morris gave a slow, single nod. The math was undeniable. "I want you back in position at first light," he said. It wasn't a request. That night, as the jungle cooled around him, George cleaned his Winchester again. The smell of gun oil was a familiar comfort. He ran the numbers in his head. 11 snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 5 were dead, 6 remained. And tomorrow, they would all be waiting for him. The element of surprise was gone. He was no longer an oddity. He was a primary target. The hunt was now a 2-way street. He loaded 5 fresh rounds into the rifle's magazine, the click of the bolt a promise of what was to come. Sleep was slow to find him, his mind already in the trees, searching for movement in the dark. January 23rd dawned not with light, but with water. A heavy, tropical downpour hammered the jungle, turning the ground into a slick morass and reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. George sat in the same bunker, a cold, damp patience settling over him. The rain was a double-edged sword. It concealed him, but it also concealed his prey. He waited, listening to the drumming on the bunker's crumbling roof. The rain finally slowed to a drizzle at 8:15, and by 8:45, a hazy gray light filtered through the canopy, enough to see. They had adapted. The first sniper of the day appeared at 9:12, positioned in a tree 290 yards out, farther than any engagement the day before. They were testing his range, learning his capabilities. George compensated, his mind automatically calculating the extra drop. The shot was clean. The sniper fell. The 6th kill. The response was swift and brutal. At 9:57, the world erupted. The first mortar round landed 40 yards short of his bunker, the explosion a muffled crump in the wet earth. Dirt and shattered vegetation rained down. George didn't move, his heart hammering. He was calculating. The second salvo walked closer, 20 yards short, the concussions shaking the bunker. They had his range. The third salvo would be direct. He grabbed his Winchester, scrambled out of the bunker, and sprinted north along the tree line. He was not a moment too soon. He dove headfirst into a water-filled shell crater as the third salvo obliterated the bunker. The sound was deafening, a rolling thunder of explosions that sent wood, concrete, and metal shrieking through the air where he had just been sitting. He was covered in mud and water, but alive. They had triangulated his position from his muzzle flash or the sound of his shot. This was a new level of opposition. He relocated to a new position, a massive fallen tree about 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. It provided solid cover and a fresh, unexpected sightline into the groves. The dynamic of the hunt had irrevocably shifted. The Japanese knew a specific, deadly American marksman was hunting them, and they were now actively hunting him back. This was no longer a static shooting gallery. It was a mobile duel between professionals. The afternoon was a tense game of cat and mouse. The Japanese sent more snipers, their movements more cautious, their hides more clever. But George had the superior tool and the superior training. At 14:23, he identified a slight inconsistency in the foliage of a tree 250 yards out. He waited, watching, until a shift in the sun angle revealed the outline of a shoulder. He fired. The 7th sniper fell. At 15:41, he spotted his 8th target, positioned high in a banyan tree, nearly 95 feet up. The concealment was excellent, but the height worked against the sniper as the sun began its descent, creating a faint silhouette against the lighter sky. George's shot was true. At 1700 hours, a runner from Captain Morris found him. He was ordered back to headquarters. Morris wanted numbers. 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, George reported, his voice flat with exhaustion. 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris didn't offer praise. He offered orders. George was to continue his operations at dawn on January 24th. That night, the mathematics were grimly simple. 11 snipers total. 8 dead. 3 remained. These 3 would be the best of the best, the most experienced, the most cunning, the ones who had survived not just the American assault, but 2 days of his own personal war. They knew his face now, his methods, and the distinct sound of his rifle. The easy part was over. He cleaned the Winchester meticulously, the ritual a comfort. He loaded 5 fresh rounds, the brass gleaming in the dim light. Sleep was a fleeting visitor. At 0300 he gave up, sitting in his tent with the rifle across his lap, listening to the jungle and waiting for the dawn, knowing it would bring the hardest fight of his life. The rain started again at 04:15 on January 24th, a steady, soaking curtain that delayed first light and turned the world into a gray, dripping haze. George used the poor visibility not as a hindrance, but as camouflage. He abandoned his previous positions, the destroyed bunker, the fallen log. They were compromised. He needed somewhere new, somewhere unexpected. He moved south, settling into a cluster of large rocks the Marines had once used as a machine gun nest. It offered solid cover and an elevated, oblique view of the groves, a perspective the Japanese snipers wouldn't anticipate. At 07:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The jungle began to materialize out of the mist. George started his methodical scan, his scope piercing the gloom. At 08:17, he found one. Sniper number 9 was positioned unusually low, only 40 feet up in a palm tree about 190 yards out. The palm fronds created a natural hide, making him nearly invisible from the ground. But George was elevated on the rocks, looking down into the foliage. He could see the dark shape of the man's shoulders and head. It was a clear shot. His finger tightened on the trigger, a motion as natural as breathing. Then he stopped. A cold prickle of instinct ran down his spine. It was too easy. After 2 days of being hunted, the remaining snipers would not make such an elementary mistake. This had to be bait. A decoy, positioned to draw a shot and reveal his new location to the real threat. He lowered the rifle, ignoring the tempting target. Instead, he expanded his search, scanning the trees surrounding the palm with painstaking slowness. It took 11 minutes. At 08:28, his patience was rewarded. There, in a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up, was the real threat. A Japanese sniper was perfectly concealed in a nest of branches and vines, his rifle covering the area around the decoy, waiting for the muzzle flash that would sign George's death warrant. George was faced with a tactical nightmare. The real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him first, the sound would instantly reveal his actual position, and the sniper could relocate before George could chamber another round. He needed to use their own trap against them. He made his decision. He aimed again at the decoy in the palm tree. He took the shot. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from his perch. As planned, the real sniper in the banyan tree reacted instantly, turning his head and rifle toward the source of the sound. That slight movement was all George needed. He had already swung his Winchester back, his muscles coiled. He found the shifting shadow in his scope and fired a second time before the sniper could complete his turn. The man tumbled from his lofty perch. 2 shots, 2 more kills. 10 confirmed. But he had announced his position with 2 consecutive shots. He grabbed his gear and ran, scrambling east along the rock line and diving into a muddy drainage ditch. Just 6 seconds later, a Japanese machine gun opened up, its fire raking the rocks he had just vacated, chewing the position to splinters. Soaking and covered in mud, he relocated again to a water-filled shell crater 100 yards east. He settled into the chest-deep, foul water, resting his Winchester on the crater rim. 10 down, 1 to go. The 11th sniper, the last man standing. He would be the most dangerous of them all. And George realized his mistake. He had been looking in the wrong place. At 09:47, he saw movement not in the trees, but on the ground. 60 yards south, a shape was moving low and slow through the undergrowth, using ferns and fallen logs for cover. It was the 11th sniper, and he was stalking George. He was crawling methodically toward the rocks, following George's most likely escape route. George remained frozen in the crater, only his eyes and the top of his head above the waterline. The sniper on the ground was a professional. He stopped, studied the rocks, then advanced again with infinite patience. He was closing the distance, yard by yard. He finally reached the rocks and took up a position, his rifle aimed east toward the drainage ditch, where he expected George to be. His back was now exposed to George's actual position, a mere 38 yards away. It was an easy shot. Yet again, George hesitated. This man had outlived 10 others. He wouldn't make such a basic error. This felt like another decoy. George kept his scope on the man in the rocks, but widened his focus. And there it was. At 10:06, he spotted the real threat. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest, hidden behind a fallen tree trunk, his rifle aimed covering the drainage ditch. It was a pair. The 11th sniper had brought a partner. George couldn't engage both with a bolt-action rifle. He would get one, but the other would kill him. So he chose a third option: absolute stillness. He sank deeper into the muddy water until only his eyes broke the surface. He waited. His patience paid off. After 10 minutes of seeing nothing in the ditch, the soldier in the rocks grew impatient. He stood up, signaled to his partner, and both began to move east, sweeping the area, their backs turned to George's crater. They walked right past him. As they moved beyond his position, George rose from the water with a slow, deliberate silence. Water streamed from his uniform and the rifle's barrel. He shouldered the Winchester. 42 yards. He fired. The first soldier dropped. He worked the bolt, the spent cartridge flying, and swung onto the second soldier, who was spinning around in surprise. George fired first. The second man fell. 11 shots over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. The groves of Point Cruz were silent. The immediate threat was eliminated. But as George climbed, exhausted from the crater, a new sound froze him in his tracks. Voices. Japanese voices. Multiple men coming from the tree line. An infantry patrol drawn by the gunfire. The snipers hadn't been working alone. The duel was over, but the battle for survival was just beginning. The voices grew louder, closer. These weren't the silent hunters of the trees. This was the blunt instrument of an infantry patrol, likely sent to investigate the prolonged sniper duel or retrieve the bodies. George dropped back into the crater, the cold, muddy water swallowing him once again. He held his Winchester vertically, keeping the barrel clear, and submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface, a crocodile in his wallow. He counted at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more. They moved with a purpose he could hear, branches snapping, equipment rattling. They stopped at the first body, 42 yards from his hiding spot. The conversation was urgent, the tones sharp with anger and alarm. Then they moved to the second body. More talking. Then, silence for a moment, followed by a new, more deliberate movement. They had found his tracks, the boot prints leading from the rocks to the water-filled crater. The voices began moving toward him. 30 yards. 25. 20. The odds were impossible. 5 rounds left in a bolt-action rifle against a minimum of 6 enemy soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He had 2 choices: stay hidden and pray they passed by, or fight. At 10:31, the decision was made for him. A Japanese soldier appeared directly at the crater's rim, looking down. Their eyes met. There was a split second of stunned recognition. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. Chaos erupted. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered a new round, and rose. 2 more soldiers were at the rim, bringing their rifles to bear. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both dropped. 3 rounds left. Shouting filled the air. He could hear more soldiers rushing his position. He scrambled out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices, and sprinted 20 yards before diving behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle, bullets snapping past his head, kicking up dirt around the crater, and thudding into his log cover. They were firing at his last known position, at sound, at movement. He stayed low, peering through his scope. He saw movement, 2 soldiers advancing cautiously 50 yards out. He aimed at the lead soldier, fired. The man dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. He heard more voices now behind him. They were flanking him. He was about to be surrounded. Retreat was the only option. He could not win a stand-up fight. He grabbed his rifle and ran north, crashing through the undergrowth, vines catching his boots, branches whipping his face. Rifle fire followed him, but it was wild, unaimed. He ran for a solid 90 seconds before diving into another, drier shell crater. He pressed against the earth, listening. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued aggressively. They were regrouping around their dead. He checked his rifle. Mud caked the stock. Water still dripped from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no more stripper clips. He was effectively out of the fight. At 10:47, he began moving again, not running, but walking with a low, careful purpose, using the terrain for cover as he moved northeast toward the American lines. The jungle fell silent around him, holding its breath. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him, rifle raised. George identified himself, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. The sentry led him through the lines. He walked directly to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it, his report clinical and precise. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired for 11 hits. Then the firefight with the infantry patrol, 3 more kills. 5 rounds expended in that engagement. Morris asked about his ammunition status. 2 rounds, sir, George replied. Morris asked about the rifle. Functional, but needs cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris simply nodded. He told George to clean his weapon and rest. There would be no operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Later that afternoon, a summons came from division headquarters. George arrived, wondering if he was in trouble for the unauthorized infantry engagement. Instead, he found Captain Morris and the regimental commander, Colonel Ferry. Ferry had one question, born from the undeniable results of the past 4 days. Can you train other men to do what you did? George said he could try, but it would require time, rifles with scopes, and men who could already shoot. Ferry told him Division had 14 Springfield rifles with Unertl scopes left behind by the Marines, and he had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, to train them, to develop tactics, and to clear any remaining Japanese threats from their operational areas. George accepted immediately. He had only one condition. I want to keep my Winchester. Colonel Ferry approved the request. The mail-order rifle that had been mocked, tested, and proven beyond all doubt would remain in the hands of the man who had changed the battalion's war. The sniper section began training on January 27th at a makeshift range east of Henderson Field. George stood before 40 men who had proven themselves on paper targets, but none had ever hunted a man. He started with the fundamentals he had lived by for years: the control of breath, the gentle squeeze of the trigger, the art of reading the wind. The Army-issued Springfield sniper rifles were heavier than his Winchester, and he taught them to use the jungle itself for support: logs, rocks, anything to create a stable platform in an unstable world. He divided them into 2-man teams, shooter and spotter, a lesson learned from the Japanese pairs he had faced. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, providing security and a second set of eyes. It was a system that prevented a single point of failure. By January 30th, most of the men could consistently hit a man-sized target at 300 yards under real field conditions. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese stragglers west of the Matanikaw River. Paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes, George set up overlooking a known enemy trail. At 07:20, a Japanese soldier appeared. Hayes confirmed the target. George fired. The soldier dropped. It was the first confirmed kill for the new section. By the end of the day, the 4 teams had reported 23 Japanese soldiers killed, 0 American casualties. The section's success became a tactical multiplier for the battalion. Over the next 12 days, they tallied 74 confirmed kills, systematically and silently thinning enemy ranks. But the war on Guadalcanal was ending. The Japanese were evacuating. On February 7th, during an operation near the Tenarú River, the impersonal nature of war finally caught up with George. A Japanese rifleman's bullet struck him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him down. It was a serious wound, but not fatal. Corporal Hayes dragged him to safety. As George recovered in a field hospital, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. His sniper section was officially recognized, and Colonel Ferry recommended him for a Bronze Star. But George's war was not finished. While he convalesced, orders came from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced jungle fighters for a new, classified mission behind enemy lines in Burma. George volunteered. By March, he was on a transport ship heading west, his Winchester Model 70 packed carefully in the cargo hold. He was assigned to a new unit known only as Merrill's Marauders, a long-range penetration group tasked with marching hundreds of miles through impossible terrain to capture a critical airfield in northern Burma. The jungle in Burma was steeper, wetter, and more unforgiving than Guadalcanal. George modified his rifle for the long patrols, swapping the Lyman Alaskan for a lighter Weaver scope and a synthetic stock, shaving off precious ounces. The Marauders' mission was one of sheer endurance, over 700 miles of marching, with men collapsing from exhaustion and disease. Combat was usually close-range ambushes, not the long-range duels of Point Cruz. George used his Winchester only 7 times in 3 months, but each shot was decisive. A Japanese officer at 412 yards, a machine gunner at 380, an enemy sniper at 290. He realized something in the brutal mountains of Burma. His Winchester was an exceptional instrument of precision, but modern warfare was changing. The future belonged to standardized, semi-automatic rifles. The era of the individual craftsman soldier with his custom tool was fading. The Marauders captured their objective at a terrible cost, and the battered unit was disbanded. George had survived, but the rifle, that had proven so decisive on Guadalcanal, had seen its last sustained combat. The specific, terrible beauty of the duel at Point Cruz would not be repeated. The war ended for John George not with a final shot, but with a quiet return to a country moving on. He was discharged from the Army in 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, his service recognized with 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. The military, industrial in scale and looking to the future, had little room for the lessons of a lone marksman and his personal rifle. The Garand had won the war, and new, even more standardized weapons were on the drawing board. The craftsman's approach was being replaced by the assembly line. George used the GI Bill not to rest, but to reinvent himself. He enrolled at Princeton University, graduating with highest honors in politics. He then spent 4 years at Oxford and another 4 in British East Africa as a scholar, his focus shifting from ballistics to geopolitics. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., becoming a respected executive and consultant on African affairs for the State Department. In these circles of intellectuals and diplomats, he was known for his sharp mind and quiet demeanor. Colleagues who knew he had served had no idea of the 11 snipers, the 4 days at Point Cruz, or the rifle. That part of his life was locked away. But some memories demand to be recorded. In 1947, he began to write. It was not for fame or glory. It was a technical manual, a clinical record of what he had learned about weapons, ammunition, and small unit tactics in jungle warfare. He wrote for 6 months, the manuscript growing to over 400 pages of precise, unembellished observation. A friend at the National Rifle Association convinced him to publish it. The book, Shots Fired in Anger, was released that same year. Devoid of hero worship and full of hard-earned truths, it became an instant classic among soldiers, historians, and firearms enthusiasts, a foundational text that is still in print and referenced today. John George lived long enough to see the world change. He watched the military formally embrace the sniper as a specialized profession, the very concept he had helped prove on Guadalcanal. He saw the M1 Garand give way to the M14 and then the M16. He saw the lessons of World War II be rediscovered and refined in new jungles, in new wars. He never spoke publicly about his own deeds, but his book spoke for him, ensuring that the hard-won knowledge would not be forgotten. He passed away on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. His Winchester Model 70, the mail-order sweetheart, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. There it rests in a quiet display case. To the casual visitor, it is indistinguishable from 1,000 other vintage hunting rifles, a beautiful but seemingly ordinary object. But its ordinary appearance belies an extraordinary truth. It is the rifle that, in the hands of a quiet champion, silenced the mockery of an entire battalion. It is the tool that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days, achieving what weeks of conventional fighting could not. It is the instrument that helped convince the U.S. military of the devastating power of a single, well-aimed shot. It stands not as a relic of war, but as a timeless testament to the power of individual skill, unwavering conviction, and the right tool in the right hands. The echo of its report on Guadalcanal is a whisper in history now, but its message remains clear. Precision, patience, and courage can forever change the outcome of a battle. Did the story of John George's courage and skill move you? If it did, we would be honored to have you join us on this journey. Every like and every time you subscribe holds immense meaning. It's the fuel that drives us to keep sifting through dusty archives, unearthing powerful, real-life stories of valor like this one. We're listening, and we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you joining us from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or the land down under, Australia? Our community spans the entire globe, and every comment you leave, even just a simple hello, truly warms our hearts. Thank you for listening and for helping us preserve the memory of John George. Soldiers like him deserve to be remembered, and you are the one making that a reality.